I'm very excited for today's talk. We have internationally renowned Dr. Jill Ehrenreich-May, and who is a professor of psychology, pediatrics and psychiatry and behavioral sciences, and associate chair in the Department of Psychology at the University of Miami. Dr. Ehrenreich-May's research is concerned with development, evaluation, and dissemination and implementation of transdiagnostic programs for youth presenting with or at risk for anxiety, depression, and related disorders and concerns. She operates a research clinic at the University of Miami, the Child and Adolescent Mood and Anxiety Treatment Program, which serves as a hub for training in evidence-based practices and allows for the study of mechanisms and outcomes associated with transdiagnostic treatments for youth. She has over 160 peer-reviewed publications and books on these topics, as well as her research is funded by the U.S. National Institutes of Health, Institute of Education Sciences, and foundation sources currently. She is also heavily involved with clinical science organizations. For example, she is the current president of the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. It is my great pleasure to have you here. Please join me in a warm welcome, and I'm going to pass the mic to you.
Well, thank you for that incredibly nice welcome. I'm thrilled to be here and so excited to share with you some of our work. I did present at UCSF. I did a workshop several years ago now. And so I'm really excited to be back and to be able to share some of the research and the updates that we've had in the intervening years on this work with you all. So thank you again for the invitation. Just before I get started, I will be just acknowledging a couple of conflicts of interest. I do receive a royalty for the sales of a book that we're going to be referencing a lot here, the Unified Protocols for Transdiagnostic Treatment of Emotional Disorders in Children and Adolescents, and sometimes get paid for clinical training and consultation and support services. It's also a focus of a lot of my research, as well as services funding, things from NIH, the Institute for Education Sciences, the Henry Ford Foundation, and then some local charitable organizations here in Miami, the Batchelor Foundation and the Children's Trust. And of course, I need to acknowledge the team that has worked on this. This is just my current team. Believe it or not, this is right across the street from our offices here in Miami. It's right at a kind of a hotel across the street where we were having a happy hour. None of this work happens just from me or all my effort. So I really want to thank all of them for everything that they do to make the lives better of a lot of the children and families that come and seek services or seek research treatment services from us. And when I used to start these talks, I would often reference the idea that anxiety and depression were on the rise, or that perhaps, we would see, as we did kind of pre-pandemic, a more of a spike in depressogenic symptoms and suicidality in early adolescents or young adults. But of course, during COVID, we saw an incredibly large spike in emotional problems in youth. So in the meta-analysis from the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2021, about 20% of youth were reported to experience clinically significant symptoms of anxiety, and a full quarter, 25% of youth were reporting clinically significant symptoms of depression. So 1/4 of youth across studies around the globe. And of course, when you see numbers like this, you obviously think, well, what is being done to assist this really enormous need for mental health treatment? And the short answer is we don't know. We don't really know how many of these kids are getting certainly adequate services, or really much in the way of any services at all. We really have a great shortage of providers, as we know, and to meet even the need that existed pre-pandemic. If we go back to 2019, the CDC published statistics that suggested that about 13% of youth between the ages of 5 and 17 received any form of mental health assistance, any kind of counseling, even one session within the last year. And we know that the vast majority of that is going to be for behavior problems, not necessarily for emotional problems. So we might maybe optimistically say that 5% of those youth received some level of counseling or assistance for an emotional problem or disorder. And that begs the question, of course, what were they getting? You know, if we take, again, a very optimistic portrait of that, what clinicians say that they do, then 40 to 60% of clinicians say they use some level of evidence-based therapy technique for these types of problems. But generally speaking, the most frequently used types of techniques here would be probably what we might consider the less active elements of treatment. So things like psychoeducation, for example. So, you know, this really just references the frequency of the problem, the scope of the problem. And, you know, it is not uncommon for people to reference even these types of numbers related to internalizing or emotional problems in youth and say, well, but they're kind of transient, they come and they go. And really that doesn't comport with what we know about things like anxiety and depression. Maybe the intensity waxes and wanes over time, but these tend to be highly impairing concerns that interfere with functioning across multiple domains, and certainly increase risk for a trajectory of subsequent psychopathology and negative outcomes lasting into adulthood. So given the huge international need for assistance related to youth emotional disorders, you would probably think that it would be a main priority as a society to train a workforce of clinicians to disseminate some of these many evidence-based psychotherapy manuals that have been developed over the last 50 years. And those that in fact contain active mechanistic elements of change, things like exposure or problem-solving techniques for children in need. Interestingly, most of this treatment development is historically focused on kind of single problems or single emotional problems, if we're talking about emotional disorders, or sometimes a very narrow range of emotional disorders in youth. And that makes sense from an internal validity perspective. Like you can see change in one problem or a small group of problems from that are defined by the DSM from pre to post treatment, for example. However, we know that most organizations are lacking funds and lacking providers to do this type of treatment on any evidence-based treatment consistently. So picking just one problem-specific or disorder-specific approach to spend funds and capital on, as good as the efficacy, and I'm not questioning the efficacy of any of these approaches, right? These are excellent manuals. I own most of them, and I like all of them. May not be using our training time efficiently, may not be consistent, of course, with how most youth present in clinical practice. So on that latter point, I think it is fair to say that it is very rare for a child to present with only one type of problem when they are presented for clinical services. So when we see children presenting, it is typically with one emotional problem. It is most typical that they present with some other type of comorbidity, most frequently another emotional disorder, but certainly other things like behavior problems, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, et cetera, are also very common. And as a child person, you think about comorbidity right here and now, but you also think about it from a developmental standpoint, the kind of the sequential comorbidity that may occur over time as well. So something like separation anxiety, for example, begetting generalized anxiety, and then depression, for example. So we also have to kind of think preventatively. Some people have suggested that this type of comorbidity, when it's cited, is just an artifact of kind of the overlap between symptoms of things like rumination or concentration problems in youth between these sort of emotional disorder DSM categories, but that doesn't really fully explain the co-presentation of even these different domains at the same time of problems. And I think it's fair to say that when we think about all of the stressors in our world, not just COVID, but the systemic stressors, the disparities that children face in the world today, these are not problems that only affect one type of disorder specifically, right? This is a stressful world that we're living in right now, and it may be rising up several problems at the same time. So just considering anxiety and depression again for a moment, anxiety and depression, just the two problems, really share a lot of things. They share genetic, neurobiological, and environmental risk factors. And at the symptom level, as evidenced here by child and parent reported regularized partial correlation networks on the SCARED, which is a child anxiety measure, and the mood and feelings questionnaire, which is a depression measure in 467 youth averaging about age 12 that have participated in research in my lab here at the University of Miami on the UPC and UPA. Depression and anxiety symptoms are highly intercorrelated regardless of the informant. Although you see here that symptom to symptom relationships are stronger between disorders rather than across. So you're going to have a stronger relationship with other anxiety symptoms before depression symptoms, for example. And I think what's interesting is that many of us who have taken a transdiagnostic or a multi-diagnostic approach to treatment in youth have also really just cited that in those fantastic manuals that I showed you earlier, there is just pragmatically a lot of overlap between the techniques that are presented. In other words, if you dig into kind of the guts of those treatments, what you often find is a lot of similarity in the approach. Maybe differences in examples, maybe differences in the context in which it's applied, but a lot of overlap in the how of the treatment, the what of the treatment. So within these manuals, you will often see, for example, a focus on identifying emotion, being able to label it accurately within the body, understanding how emotions may in fact impact behavior and lead, in our case, very specifically to things like avoidance, escape, aggression, compulsions, how that the enactment of what we call emotional behaviors there actually ends up reinforcing the intensity of strong emotions over time. And when people experience these strong emotions, the coping strategies that are often applied within these manuals are also really similar. So you'll see things like cognitive restructuring techniques or mindful awareness techniques, sometimes things like behavioral experiments where you're kind of getting feedback from the environment about what's going on and does that change a belief you had about that situation. And then a litany of behavioral techniques, and that could be inclusive of things like behavioral activation, problem solving, exposure, interpersonal effectiveness techniques. One thing that tends to be a little bit different between protocols or manuals is often to the degree to which caregivers are involved and how they're involved. So some of these approaches only use kind of a psychoeducational approach with caregivers, whereby perhaps they receive a summary of what's going on in session, how they can help with homework or something related that the youth can practice in their environment. Others have a full mechanistic focus on particular behaviors that caregivers may be engaging in when they feel strong emotions, and particularly those, say, for example, accommodation of anxiety and avoidance that may lead to reinforcement or strengthening of child emotional disorders over time. So in response to needs for a treatment that address core processes underlying co-occurring emotional disorders and sort of the overarching similarity between effective techniques for these conditions, my research group has developed an intervention for youth that focuses on what we might think of as a singular core dysfunction in emotional disorders. So what we mean by this is that instead of focusing on circumscribed emotions or situations that only fall within one diagnostic category, our approach, the UPC and UPA, focuses on the experience of strong emotions and both youth and caregivers' relationships to them more broadly. It does this using a particularly flexible, modular treatment structure. And the way we kind of get away with this is that we focus on the experience of emotions writ broad. So we don't necessarily focus on just one type of emotion or in one type of situation. And this allows evidence-based treatment techniques like those that I just showed you to be applied across problem area. So the working theory behind the UP is that neuroticism is this core dysfunction or higher order factor that gives rise to mental disorders like things like anxiety, depression, OCD, and can be engaged in treatment with those who experience differing emotional problems. So from a conceptual point of view, neuroticism here might refer to children who have heightened affectivity in response to stimuli and situations. And when they feel their feelings, they may have trouble tolerating that experience. So they may have thoughts, or they may just physically feel very uncomfortable. And, of course, if you're feeling your feelings and you feel like you can't tolerate them, you're going to probably want them to stop right away. And whether you can express that fully as a child or not, you may take some actions to try to eliminate that experience quickly. So that goes back to that avoidance, escape, compulsions, depression, aggression, things along those lines. And like I said, that works, right, in the short term. But it backfires, as we know, leading to more frequent and intense emotions and kind of starting that cycle of negative affectivity all over again and maintaining this sort of construct of neuroticism. So as parents as well, we may see our kids having these heightened reactions to emotions and have strong feelings ourselves that may lead to other unhelpful behaviors that also end up reinforcing this cycle of negative affectivity and neuroticism. Our research on youth with emotional disorders suggests that these aspects of neuroticism do in fact form a latent construct, and that this latent construct of neuroticism predicts scores on parent and child related things like anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive symptoms, and overall severity. The UPC and UPA have 8 core treatment components. I'm not really showing our kind of our self-monitoring and case conceptualization module or our review and consolidation modules here. But each of these things, each of these technique sort of groups are thought to engage putative mechanistic targets, specifically aversive reactions to frequently occurring negative emotions. And we measure this using things like measures of distress tolerance or avoidance. And movement on those targets, we assume, in turn, should lead to lesser emotional disorder severity or lesser symptom severity. And I just want to say, I'm not over focusing on the treatment content here, but please understand that these are realized in a very developmentally sensitive way across our adolescent and younger child components of the treatment. We do call them kind of separate treatments for a reason, although they have the same content. They are presented in very different ways. And one developmentally sensitive aspect of the UPC and UPA is our completely concurrent caregiver modules. So for example, in the UPC, if you conduct it in group, which many people do, caregivers are encouraged to work on and improve tolerance of their own emotional distress through weekly sessions, and particularly to practice this while engaging with a highly emotional child and really notice what kinds of emotional caregiving behaviors are occurring in that context. So things like accommodating, lessening sort of the experience of that child's distress, engaging in inconsistent reinforcement and discipline practices, providing a lot of negative social attention or just a lot of attention, period, in the context of distress. I was actually just before this talking in supervision with somebody about that very thing happening with a family. And, for parents who are, or caregivers who are having a lot of dysregulation themselves, we may also have to work on modeling of distress. how they are handling their own emotions in front of the child, and how they are sort of setting an example. Because some of these behaviors, again, we think are likely leading to greater youth emotional distress, very much unintentionally, right? None of these families are hoping to make their child worse by any stretch of the imagination. They think they're helping. And that helping strategy is backfiring and perhaps leading to greater perceptions of threat, lesser emotional self-efficacy from children. And so we really work on what we call opposite caregiving behaviors to try to support change in these targets. So I'm going to spend the remaining part of our talk really going over some of the research that we've done on the UPC and UPA over the years, particularly the last 15 years, and some major lessons that I feel like we've taken away from that research. So first, it's good that this is true. We think that this treatment works, at least in terms of in our research clinic samples, which are very particular samples, as we know, of persons who are very privileged and able to come in and receive services in that type of context. So early on, I had a K award from NIMH to develop the UPA. That was the first randomized controlled trial that we did. And in that context, we were comparing 16 weeks of receipt of the UPA to an 8-week waitlist control. So this was a very initial kind of trial. These were pretty severe adolescents. They were older. We didn't exclude for things like suicidality. And so these were kids who were really in need. And interestingly, what we saw was that at 8 weeks, which will come back up when I show you some of the briefer models we've been able to engage later, we did see improvements in symptom severity, but only on clinician rated measures, not on self-reports. But then when we collapsed all the groups, when everybody received treatment and we could look at the full trajectories, and these are using MMLM analyses, what we do see is in fact significant effects and relatively large effect sizes across both clinician rated measures and things like the ARCADS, anxiety and depression scales, anxiety life interference, et cetera, and effect sizes of around a Cohen's d of 1 to 2. After this, we developed the UPC, and we did several small trials of the UPC. There's actually a very large randomized controlled trial of the UPC going on right now. So we're really excited to soon be able to share more of those outcomes. But the early trials that we did were all very supportive of the UPC. And this one's a very small trial that was conducted by Sarah Kennedy, who's pictured here as a professor at University of Colorado, Children's Colorado now, and by Emily Bialik, who is at University of Michigan. What we compared here was UPC to another group CBT approach that was just targeting anxiety. This was for youth ages 7 to 12. And what we saw was that, frankly, in this small sample, but I think it probably would be true, this was 47 youth. We probably could have had 470 youth, and we probably would not have seen a significant difference between these two conditions. And nor were we necessarily expecting to with regard to anxiety symptoms. So we saw the same kinds of general efficacy and responder status that we see in other CBT trials, roughly 60% of youth showing remission at the post-treatment point. When we go out to the follow-up period, then we saw some interesting, again, small sample. So it could just be nothing. But we saw some interesting things starting to emerge. And some of that was in our completer sample. There was a really nice continued response to intervention at the follow-up. 94% of UPC completers were still responders at follow-up. We saw some departure in reappraisal, which was not too surprising. Reappraisal, really that cognitive flexibility domain, is something that we continue continually seem to impact very positively with the UP. And in particular, maybe because, and I used to get a lot of questions about this early on, why do we do reappraisal and problem solving and some mindfulness work? There's a lot of other places where we're encouraging cognitive flexibility. So it's interesting that we've seen some really robust effects on this mechanism, but it's not terribly surprising given all the content on that particular domain. And then some departure around sadness dysregulation, but again, small sample. And, of course, we did not pre-pandemic do much on telehealth. But of course, during the pandemic, like all of you, we immediately switched to telehealth. And so we've been putting together our data to really understand if there were any differences in the efficacy or sort of the effect sizes that we would see from the intervention. These are just some preliminary findings with 93 of our youth who've received treatment on telehealth since, and again, most of them during the pandemic. We now continue to provide services about 50-50 in person and telehealth. So we have even more data now to look at. Satisfaction has been very high with telehealth. There's been no significant differences on any of our symptom domains. Interestingly, there's kind of this emergent possible difference with depression, where there seem to potentially be some greater effects of in-person, but we're continuing to look at this, but nothing significant as of yet. Which is nice, which would suggest that you can do it both ways. But I will tell you, UPC group on telehealth is difficult. It's possible, but it's difficult to wrangle young kids on a group. And there's a lot of modifications that you have to make. We've looked at parent psychopathology, all seems to improve following the UPC and UPA to the extent that it's problematic. Interestingly, when we've looked at, well, what actually impacts youth symptom outcomes, it comports very nicely with our mechanistic idea of what we're doing in the caregiver materials. It does seem like changes in caregiver distress tolerance, along with youth symptom severity, do seem to predict post-treatment outcomes, and increases in cognitive flexibility amongst caregivers seems to be associated with early response to the intervention. So parents who are able to kind of, be flexible in their own thinking about what's going on may have children who are more likely to respond. Now that may be conflated with their child's functioning. So we'll have to see, but it's something that my student Lauren is very interested in. So I think we'll continue to follow up. A while ago, we did an analysis of predictors of UPC outcome. You would sort of hope in a transdiagnostic intervention that there would be few predictors of outcome, right? You want this to sort of equally benefit persons as much as possible, and particularly also across symptom domains. And that's generally the case, at least with a small sample of those who received UPC. The only predictor of lesser, not necessarily negative outcome, lesser outcome is high social anxiety at baseline. This finding haunts me in my dreams because, frankly, I think about, it is probably difficult for a really highly socially anxious youth who has a treatment that is just talking about their emotions to engage right away, right? So we have to do a little extra work to make sure that youth with high social anxiety at baseline are really feeling comfortable. We may need to kind of divert to some more, problem-specific discussion and kind of ease them into the emotion-focused discussion a little bit more. And it's something we've seen across some other analyses that we've done as well, but we're doing a much larger predictors paper right now with UPA. So how does the UP work? Does it kind of follow sort of, predictable patterns based on its purported theory? And generally speaking, the answer, I think, to this question is probably yes. But, obviously, we're very interested in putative mechanisms or how the UP exerts its effects. So first we wondered if the skills in the UP, each of which are aimed at cultivating a more accepting, approach-oriented stance toward emotions, improved across treatment with the UP and understanding what impact that has on symptoms. So using the UPA, we first addressed this question using a multiple baseline design trial with 7 adolescents. This was work by Jamie Sherman. And we examined timing of changes in distress tolerance and emotional avoidance using key cognitive flexibility and behavioral skill modules. So we use this really cool analytic technique with this, it's called simulation modeling analysis. And basically what we found was that most participants did show changes in distress tolerance and emotional avoidance, but oftentimes concurrently with sort of the youth symptom changes. And that's something I'll speak about more in a second. However, using the adult UP, Shannon Sowers-Vala and colleagues did find that pre to post treatment change in things like mindful emotional awareness are large in magnitude, and early change in those skills do seem to be associated at least with change in anxiety symptoms. And here you see that that effect was also found with cognitive flexibility, anxiety sensitivity, and behavioral avoidance. Of course, $1 million question, does the UP engage neuroticism? The literature here on whether behavioral treatments address neuroticism is pretty mixed, which might be due to the fact that nobody's really interested in measuring change in neuroticism, overall, where treatments are typically expressly developed to target symptoms, right? That makes sense. But when a treatment is designed to target neuroticism, we would hope that changes in this variable or the sort of components of this variable are robust. There was a UP equivalence trial comparing adult UP to single disorder approaches for adults with anxiety disorders that provided an opportunity to test this. And as a stricter test, Sowers-Vala and colleagues compared change on this variable as a function of active treatment conditions. So looking at the UP versus symptom-focused CBT protocols, and found that neuroticism indeed did change more in the UP condition. In fact, the symptom-focused CBT protocols actually look no different than the waitlist condition in this, which I think is kind of fascinating. But like I said earlier, given evidence that there's some degree of change on measures of neuroticism that reflect changes in mood or changes in anxiety, they also examine change in neuroticism controlling for simultaneous changes in depression and anxiety. And again, the UP still demonstrated a significant advantage here. So within our own sample of approximately 290 youth who've received UPC or UPA over time, we recently published findings in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, which suggested that there were identifiable latent profiles of response based on emotion regulation presentation that kind of reflect and are to be expected given some of the theoretical understanding of why this treatment might work via neuroticism. So what you see here, generally speaking, is that most of the youth who received treatment with us fell into what might be expressed as a moderately distressed and dysregulated profile across presentation of things like distress tolerance, anxiety sensitivity, negative affect reappraisal, suppression, and dysregulation. So they had the kind of the average type of result, whereas we do have a group of about 25% that's represented here by the black solid line that do seem to be predictably going to do better in the treatment from their regulation profile at baseline. So what does that mean, right? If you can predict based on baseline emotion regulation measures how these kids might do, or you can identify this group within this latent profile, they may need less treatment. They may be able to accelerate the course of treatment. These are things we're really thinking about as we move toward a second edition of the books, how to kind of modify in light of greater or lesser dysregulation, because as well as represented by the blue line, we know we have a profile that does not do as well. And we want to be really kind of thinking about, again, not doing terribly poorly, but really having a predictable pattern of response. About 10% of our youth who are more dysregulated at baseline, they may need more frequent sessions. They may need greater intensity of certain modules. They may need DBT. We'll see, and I think that, again, we can see this from the data that we have right at the start of treatment. So a kind of a sad story about evidence-based treatments has often been that what we see is that when we try to move these treatments from research clinic settings to quote unquote real world settings, right? Community mental health, school settings, other community settings in which children receive services, on a broader scale basis, that we see a real drop in the effect sizes And sometimes these treatments don't appear any different from treatment as usual or control conditions in these settings. It is very difficult to implement evidence-based practices in a variety of settings. Circumstances have to be really well structured in order for that to happen. And so, we have been looking at this from a variety of different trials and perspectives. So I'll share with you some of what we've found thus far. We recently completed a very large-scale trial with 193 adolescents. This was actually the largest trial for adolescents with emotional problems that's been funded by NIH in an effectiveness context. And what we did here was we compared the efficacy of 3 conditions across youth receiving services at community mental health centers in South Florida and in the New England area. They either got treatment as usual, so within their clinic they were randomized, and those individuals who got treatment as usual just got whatever that clinician would do normally with them. We had what we called a treatment as usual plus condition, and in that condition they also received the Youth Outcomes Questionnaire, which is a measurement and feedback program whereby the clinician can see how the youth was doing during each session from various reporters, got alerts if there were changes that indicated that the child was not doing well, and could make adjustments to their treatment on that basis. And then a third condition where they got the UPA plus the Youth Outcomes Questionnaire. So it was a pretty heavy load, I just want to say, on the UPA condition, because they had to do both things in that condition. So I have to say this has been an analytic journey, but it's a lot of variability in the sample. We've finally now coded all the sessions. We've gotten through everything. And, it's not a totally sad story. The UPA condition did outperform treatment as usual, particularly on youth-reported measures. There's just 2 examples from the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. Interesting, very robust findings on the SDQ, which may kind of represent the more diffuse psychopathology and more difficult psychopathology that we saw in this sample. I will tell you, this was not high quality UPA. I did a lot of the consultation with the clinicians in this condition, but frankly, we were very lucky if people did psychoeducation and cognitive work with a lot of the kids. That oftentimes the sessions were very spaced out over a long period of time. In fact, we had sometimes the follow-up really is actually a better estimate of what we would think of as post in a lot of these cases. So looking out 3 months later, rather than what we traditionally thought, after 16 weeks, we're going to get a good estimation of effects. So some positive news, but a lower effect size than expected. But again, in the world of effectiveness trials, this is kind of a win. There weren't a lot of moderators of effects here. We're looking at mediators right now. So hopefully more to the story. There's been another trial that just recently completed. Let's just see if it will go. A little frozen here. Okay. Oh, there we go. Another trial that recently completed in Spain, where a briefer version of the UP, which they called ProCare, was being compared to an attention control condition, which was a kind of an emotion-focused group discussion. This was all a group based, and then another group, which they called ProCare Plus, where what they did was, and I thought this was really super innovative, they identified specific risk factors for each of the youth in the groups and offered them a kind of breakout group sessions, if you will, to talk a little bit more about the different risk factors. I also really like how they presented their findings. So I'm going to show you this little quick video of how they presented their findings, because it's just cool.
Did you know that young people are experiencing emotional difficulties more than ever? Nowadays, 400 million young people are estimated to be at risk or suffer from emotional problems. More than 1.5 million are in Spain. This is a serious public health problem. ProCare Plus is the first selective prevention transdiagnostic intervention, which has proven its effectiveness in adolescents at risk of developing emotional difficulties. It consists of 8 online or face-to-face sessions in which adolescents are taught a series of tools to manage emotions. On top of that, personalized add-on sessions are included, to tailor the intervention to address risk factors such as bullying, poor healthy lifestyle habits, poor child-parent communication, or stress-related situations. Add-on sessions address individual risk factors evidenced by adolescents and social minorities. ProCare Plus has succeeded in reducing emotional distress and the risk of developing a future emotional problem, increasing the quality of life, resilience, emotional regulation, and the capacity of adolescents to manage intense emotions. ProCare Plus has proven to have more than 90% attendance and satisfaction among young people. It is crucial to work on the mental health of the youth, because there is no future without emotionally healthy adolescents.
I'm like in love with this. I want to present all my findings from now on this way. I was like, who made this video? The second that I saw it, they have like videos for all of the different, like there were different indicated prevention outcomes too. Anyway, I think what's interesting when you look at the effects of this in this trial, what we kind of see is like, yes, they got more, just more in the ProCare Plus condition, right? They got more time, these breakout sessions. When we gave them more in the regular ProCare or UPA condition, they also did better. So like when they got booster session, for example, they did better than without the booster session. So some of this may be just more was helpful. Some of it may be that it was focusing on these particular risk factors that was important. And I think this is something that we continue to be interested in. This team led by Luis Joaquin Garcia Lopez in Spain and hopefully we get to follow up with another big trial soon. And I will just tell you that moving forward, I really feel very strongly that everything that I would like to do in terms of effectiveness tests, dissemination work, really should be predicated on mixed methods work. We really learned a lot from what we call the COMET trial, our community mental health trial, about what we went in there expecting community mental health clinics to do, for example, or how these adolescents might have presented. And we didn't ask a lot of questions first. And in our new trial funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, we're doing quite the opposite. We call this our UPeace trial. And we are working with local schools here in the South Florida area, we just completed our focus groups. We're just midway through year one and about to start our first case series trial. And what a blast this has been. I kind of has restored my love of clinical trials. I'll be honest with you, just really being able to ask the persons who work within these settings, the kids who receive services there, what it is they feel they need, and to work from that lived experience out, rather than assuming what would they need. And again, I don't really want to do it differently in the future. So really excited for this new project. I will briefly just tell you a couple of other things about some adaptations of the work. I could show you many other brief formats of the UP that have worked well. It became very popular to do this type of work during the pandemic because, again, so many of us were hoping to try to reach more families more quickly. This is just one example of several trials that happened during the pandemic. This was a collaboration with Eric Storch and colleagues at Baylor University, where they were doing a 6-session parent-directed version of the UPC. This is a very kind of busy slide. And this COV-TABS variable, it's COVID-related distress. So what you see is improvements across the board with these 6 sessions in terms of psychosocial outcomes for kids. What was interesting, I love looking at satisfaction data. If you're into like treatment stuff and you want to look at something fun, always look at the satisfaction data in more depth. And what we saw here was that caregivers weren't saying to us like, hey, that was enough treatment. Like I definitely got all the things I could ever use or need for my kid. But they said that they felt confident that what they had would help them to generalize effects. And I think that this is something that we felt like during the pandemic, kind of that minimum dose to try to make sure that it would potentially be useful to families in their own environment was really important. We also did things like step care work. We did a brief UP just for caregivers for their own distress as well. We did one for parents of children with autism spectrum disorders, as well as for college age students. So again, a lot of brief UP trials during the pandemic. Right now we have funding from NIH to work on developing single session intervention modules from some of this content in collaboration with Jessica Schleider from Stony Brook University and 3C Institute in North Carolina. It's going to be really cool, whatever 5 years from now. These SBIRs take forever when it's done, but I'm really excited about it and have had a lot of fun developing it. Where we're really trying to kind of make something where it could be a standalone module where an adolescent could engage with it and get an action plan of something to do to help them right there and then in something like 20 to 30 minutes from the target skill that they acquired. There's also full versions of digital UPA available. This is an example from the Spanish language version of the UPA that is available digitally. So finally, a lot of people have taken this, notion of this being a transdiagnostic approach further than we have in a lot of our trials. So, we have largely focused on anxiety and depression, traditional treatment contexts for the services. We actually have had so many people adapt this work for other populations that we published a book through ABCT's clinical series with Oxford University Press, just kind of trying to put them all together. And what we see is a lot of setting-based adaptations. There's a great paper, again, by Sarah Kennedy and colleagues that was just published on their beautiful curricular adaptation of the UP for residential and intensive outpatient settings. I highly recommend it in cognitive behavioral practice. Others have worked on adapting this, obviously in many languages, as well as in places like pediatric settings. And then for a number of problem areas. So for things like obsessive compulsive disorder symptoms, we know, but also there's been attempts to kind of focus on things ranging from PTSD to eating problems, borderline features, misophonia, anger and irritability, early onset serious mental illness. My former research assistant and colleague, now Lana Seeger-Van Dyke, has done a beautiful job adapting these materials for minority stress. And particularly in line with her interest in terms of sexual and gender minority stress. There is a lot of actually core content from the UPEA that has stayed the same in that adaptation, but what she has really focused on largely is engagement, as well as, examples, the way in which the material is realized, the sensitivity of it. So for just as one example, she starts each session with a component she calls Queeros, where they talk about sort of heroes within the LGBTQ plus population that individuals can relate to. And she actually crowdsourced these from the groups. So persons that they wanted to hear more about, wanted to talk more about. And this is a really nice way to engage those youth within the program, and then apply some of the strategies that are within the UPA, again, within context of minority stress. So in summary, the UPC and UPA, we think works pretty well, at least in research clinic settings, and it has seemed to show quite a bit of promise in brief formats, particularly during the pandemic. It does appear to engage target mechanisms, although we need to do more work in this domain, particularly with the youth approach. There have been a lot of applications of the material for many problem areas, but I think we're starting to work on the second edition of the books. And I think one of the things we've really kind of made our mantra is making this manual easier to use. It is very thick for those of you who have ever seen the book, and how to apply it in a more optimal way across, of course, diverse youth and other community settings. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for your time. If you would like a copy of the slides, please send me an email. This is my email address. I'm happy to share them with you. And yeah, I will take this moment to pause and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ehrenreich-May. This is an extraordinary talk and extraordinary work. I will open up to questions. I will not be that hog, the host who asked the first question. So let me go ahead and open it up to folks. Please feel free to unmute yourself. I don't see a question right away in the chat. I will be a hog and take it if no one else will.
I have a question, Barbara.
Thank you, Dr. Todd.
Hi, we have also tried to do this group over telehealth, and it was, really hard, and excited to be doing it in person soon. In our clinic, we also have a depression group and a social anxiety group. And so the UP group has kind of become like a catch-all, which is great. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about specific, inclusion, exclusion criteria, especially given that we have these other resources available.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I get that a lot. And I think it is used that way a lot. For example, at Northwell Health, they require that everybody has, who's getting psychiatric services be offered a group, right? And they end up having to do something that's very general, right? They can't do very, very specific groups, or, they wouldn't have enough in certain domains and have too many in others. And so, they've been running mostly UPC, UPA groups. What I do think of is that, you have to think about certain things like size and cohesion always, right? Those are just kind of normal things you think about with a group. I do think when you have a transdiagnostic group, you have to think about it even a little bit more, because are these going to be kids that will work well together? You can't control for all those things, but sometimes we'll try to be mindful of how many kids, for example, in the group are autistic, how many in the group have ADHD, are they going to be able to sort of get through the material in an engaged, supportive way. We've had to sometimes involve more caregiver in time, especially, you think with UPA, I don't need to have the caregivers involved as much, but we have found, particularly with the telehealth groups, it's been useful to have the caregivers more involved. So sometimes we've added more caregiver sessions with the UPA telehealth groups as well. So I think that there are, a number of ways that we've tried to be sensitive to the composition and the flow of the groups, particularly with UPA. With UPC, it works fine. It's just that you have to kind of be sensitive about certain elements. I think, for example, we love top problems. We want to do them every session. It's hard to do them in a telehealth group, right? Because you can't sort of step away with anybody to do something privately the way that you could in person. So a lot of times we'll do that like ahead of time in the waiting room, before they come in like the virtual waiting room, we'll have them rate top problems before they come in. Or we'll just, like with UPC group during the pandemic, we only rated top problems with caregivers because it really just was going to be too difficult to try to do it with the youth and the caregiver in that setting. So when we've made some other adaptations, I think in terms of the content, a lot of similarities, but you have to think, particularly with UPC, where there's a lot of group activities, how to adapt them for the telehealth context. So we have, and if you want, I'm happy to share these with you. We have a lot of support PowerPoint sets and slides and things like that, we've adjusted activities for the telehealth context so that they're functionally the same, but kind of work better in a multimedia or telehealth context.
Yeah, I'm happy to say moving forward, we're doing it all in person and would love those slides anyway.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
I'll send you an email.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You mentioned the top problems method. And I remember seeing a talk where you talked about adapting that language for youth who've experienced maltreatment and who may not be, who are in foster care system, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, the adaptations that you've been working on with your colleagues for young people, minoritized people, children, youth, and families, how you've modified or adapted the language, or, and then you brought up the engagement piece. Right, for community mental health settings. And I know that's two big questions, but I'm wondering if you could speak about that.
Sure. So I think the kind of like embedded together, right? So several of my students are very interested in of course, cultural responsiveness. There's been concerns that have been levied very fairly at certain aspects of cognitive behavioral therapy as potentially being invalidating or insensitive to minoritized youth. And I think when I train people, I'm able to tell them how to adjust and use these materials in a way that feels sensitive and supportive. I think reading it on the page, it's easy to kind of sometimes potentially misuse so for example, we know from racial socialization theories that, it can be very protective to be prepared for bias or to be prepared to encounter certain types of threats. It's not, believing that the likelihood of an event is just greater than it really is, right? The way that we sometimes conceptualize of it in these in like kind of traditional CBT, so to speak. So I think where we want to be very thoughtful is sort of the use of and the modification and the sensitive delivery of content that can still be helpful for coping, but that we don't want misapplied in a minority stress context. So that's one thing that we've really been thinking about, again, especially in the second edition, how we are refining the presentation of these materials. Speaking specifically about the foster care work by Gina Dimitropoulos and colleagues up in Canada, and also some other groups. We've actually just been working with the largest domestic violence shelter here in Florida, the Lotus House, on their implementation of this work with youth. They're just a fabulous organization, does all evidence-based practices, and have really been working with us very closely. They do run things in group because that works well for them without a ton of adaptations, although the caregiver components for them needed to be modified quite a bit because they would not be able to have, like, say, concurrent caregiver groups, right? They have caregivers who are working throughout the day and, may only be able to get bits and pieces here and there. So we've had to modify for their. Same thing in the foster care setting, right? There were a lot of adaptations that were really about who was going to receive these sort of, who's going to be the caregiver, so to speak, in this model. Who was going to be supporting the practice, who was going to be reinforcing it, was going to be a caseworker, was it going to be somebody in the community? There was also a lot of reflection in that work about exposure and when children were showing readiness for exposure, what material could be worked on more slowly versus children who were indicating. And, going back to some of that latent profile work, we may be able to see early on who might be more ready, for some of this, the more kind of behavioral components, and who might need to work into them over a greater number of sessions, for example. What's interesting was in the initial modifications for the foster care setting, they got rid of some things that they thought might be invalidating or, like top problems. And then they ended up going back to them later and bringing them back in, because they wanted that idiographic kind or personalized assessment. And in talking further with families that felt it did not feel invalidating to them to have that context. And so I think, so we want to be very sensitive, but not always make assumptions. And I think this is really why, some persons may want to kind of do more of this mixed methods approach to adaptation wherever they can. Just a focus group, right, can help you very clearly in sort of making some decisions about adaptations. I do want to say, Yvette, I do see your comments in the chat about the video. I didn't make the video, but I will absolutely go back to the source and share with them your feedback. So I really appreciate that. I just wanted to let you know that I saw it.
Dr. Angie Lin, you had a question. Are you still around?
Hi, yes, here I am. Yeah, great. I really enjoyed this talk, and I had a question. We work with kids who are on the spectrum, autism spectrum disorder, and I might have missed it. Maybe you already mentioned this, but how has this worked for kids who are on the spectrum?
Yeah, it's funny. We We have, so the way we are embedded here, we've just been talking about this. We're applying for a very large services grant to open up a lot greater free service here with a local children's group. And we have always been embedded physically with our CARD center here, which is our Center for Autism Related Disabilities. Is funded by the state. So they offer services here also for children, like social skills groups and things like that, for children who are autistic. And I think that one of the things that we have been really thinking about, is we get a number of referrals for them, and we embed them within both of our groups and our regular UP treatment. And it hasn't been a real difficulty. It's been happening from the beginning. But I do think that we get referred kids who are very high functioning and have the verbal ability to be able to engage around the material at a pretty high level. But I do think that there's a value in a lot of the emotion labeling material, in the way in which this is framed for children, for children with autism spectrum disorders. So I think there's value. I think it's very similar to even some other emotion regulation focused treatments that have been developed for children with autism spectrum disorders. And so we're really excited about this new project because I think we're going to have exclusive groups for children, UPC and UPA groups for children with autism. So more to come in terms of being able to assess on a larger scale. It just always felt like we've had too small of a sample to do more than we did. We've done a couple of posters, but nothing definitive.
We probably have room for one brief question, and Ehrenreich-May Lee, if you'd like to ask your question, go right ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for what a wonderful talk this has been and so enlightening. I was wondering if the treatment, if there are any adaptations for use in primary care settings.
Oh yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So yes and no. So there's a trial going on right now. I think I referenced in the beginning funding from the Henry Ford Foundation. There's a trial going on through family medicine clinics with the U.S. Army, where they are piloting, again, a very brief UPC in pediatric settings. There have been, and so this is kind of like a standalone group that families can bring their child to. It's been really interesting because some of the parents are deployed. So how they run the caregiver group has been kind of unique with that material. I've been approached by several people with regard to embedding within pediatrics, but they tend to be kind of one-off projects, where somebody adapts. And I think this may be true because some of the pediatric settings are so different from each other that I've consulted in adaptation and how we make this work for that particular pediatric setting. But there haven't been consistent findings published on the topic.
Thanks for that. Unfortunately, we have to end. That's never enough time. This was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you, everyone else. I hope everyone has safe and joyful rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Take good care.